Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And we know there's many people on this call from around the world. And welcome to this fourth Infrastructure Intelligence webinar as part of our series on coming out of COVID. These events have been very well attended so far, and I'm sure today will be no exception because we're discussing the very interesting and, dare I say, vital issue of business models in our industry and how they might change or ought to change in a post-virus world. We have an expert panel with us as always for this morning's event, drawn from all parts of the industry. And I think it's fair to say that even before we had the coronavirus crisis, there was quite a lot of talk and discussion and chatter in the industry about the need to find a better way of delivering services across the construction and infrastructure sector. And I think it's probably also fair to say that the importance of that issue has actually been raised as a result of this particular crisis. So today we will be looking at this whole question of business models, how they need to change, why they need to change, what they even are in the first instance, because many people sometimes don't really understand what they mean by a business model. Anyway, let's get underway for the webinar today. Just to explain, as usual, that all of our four speakers will speak first briefly, and then we'll open it up for discussion. If you do have a question, then please post it in the questions box that should be sitting on your device that you're attending this webinar through. Just put the question in there. If you can put your organization in there as well, I'm more than happy to give your organization a shout out if you so wish. You don't have to, but just to let you know on that, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we possibly can during the course of the discussion during the webinar. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm Andy Walker, by the way, but it does say that on the screen, so if you're the observant amongst you will know that anyway. So our first speaker today is Anne Bentley, who is Global Board Director for Ryder Levett Bucknall, but she's also the Business Models Lead at the Construction Leadership Council. So I know we'll be extremely knowledgeable on this particular issue. And the Construction Leadership Council have been playing an excellent role, I have to say, during the course of the COVID crisis in terms of working on behalf of the whole industry, but on an ongoing basis have been looking at a number of areas of the construction sector, including this whole area of business models. So without further ado, Anne Bentley, it's over to you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. So when I was asked to sort of take part in this panel, I think I sort of went back to first principles, and my first question was, well, what is a business model? I think this is something that is vastly misunderstood by many people, and the term business model is actually used to describe lots of things. So, you know, the starting point was, are we talking about the specific business models of the 2 million plus companies that operate within the sort of wider construction sector, if you like, because many people are self-employed, but they still have a business model? Or are we actually talking about the system within which, you know, we all work? And I think that those two things get quite confused. I'm sort of assuming that we're talking about the business systems rather than the individual models. I mean, at the end of the day, an individual model is a way that a business operates, it's a way that a business gets its product to market, it's a way that a business makes a profit. And I think it's unlikely that as an industry we're ever going to get deeply involved in the day-to-day running of each other's businesses. You know, but we're all there to make a profit, we're all there to compete at the end of the day. The problem is, though, I think that when we talk about business models, we actually are probably more talking about main contractors' business models. And I think that we give very little attention, in truth, to what the clients are trying to achieve, the models that developers might be working on, even consultants' models, particularly subcontractors' models. And actually, I would say until coronavirus, very few people that worked outside of the materials end of construction had the faintest idea how material suppliers' business models worked. It was just stuff we bought and it arrived and we paid for it, really. And again, how their models worked didn't seem to interact with anybody else's models. We found very quickly that when plaster wasn't available, they were working to very different business models to other parts of the industry. So it was well understood, well before coronavirus hit us, that main contractors were operating at margins of 1 or 2%, that subcontractors tend to bear the brunt of funding the industry. They often don't get paid, but indeed have to pay their own suppliers, that retentions are often larger than profit margins on construction work, and that clients are often disappointed with the quality and even the functionality of the assets that are built. So we have pretty much an unhappy industry from top to bottom, from side to side. Looking back on this, I think that the position worsened or has worsened since the global financial crisis and the austerity measures that followed that. That isn't true in all areas of construction, actually, and I will come in a moment onto some areas of very good practice. But actually, the GFC, I would say, led to even greater focus on price, extreme price competition, a tax environment that favoured self-employment, and a long-term lack of pipeline, which meant that it was almost impossible for businesses to plan for more than a few months or possibly a couple of years ahead, which of course isn't conducive to a sensible business model. This in turn led to what has been coined right across the industry now as the race to the bottom. It led to new delivery teams on every project. And in my view, it led to people concentrating on project inputs, so things like the contracts, the specification, the cost, rather than actually focusing on the very thing that they were trying to achieve in the first place, i.e. the outputs. As Andy said, back in 2017-18, I was asked to lead a piece of work for the Construction Leadership Council on business models and supply chains, and this ultimately concluded in a report that the CLC produced. Interestingly, the report itself wasn't actually on business models, it was on procurement. And we did quite a big piece of research leading up to that report. We considered the background to the current situation. We considered what had worked. We particularly considered why the recommendations that were made by both the Latham report and the Egan report weren't fully implemented. And we tried to consider the point of view of all parties across construction. As I said, what we found was that no one was happy, but fundamentally what we found was that there was an absolute lack of alignment objectives across the various parties in the industry, a lack of long-term planning and a lack of consistency. To be fair, similar work had been done by many others. So we had things like Project 13, we had the Transforming Construction Network Plus, who are doing some work on systems integration. Crown Commercial Services are looking at alliance contracts and integrated contracts. And we've got clients such as Anglian Water who have actually been using this type of procurement for a long time. But the conclusion we really led to was that this isn't actually about business models, it's about procurement. And it's actually coming up with a way of how you can integrate the actual business plan, if you like, so the very thing the client is trying to achieve, into the procurement process, so that you stand at least a fighting chance of the client achieving the thing that they wanted to achieve, and everybody who's contributing that to actually understand the role that they play within that, and they can then design their own business models around that. Our conclusion was that this was failing because of a number of factors. The factors included a fear of overdue. People didn't really understand the procurement process anyway, so they sort of made it up and always blamed overdue if they use an old-fashioned mechanism. A fundamental belief in some parties that cheapest is always best, irrespective of value. Time constraints, people often just used the example they'd had before and didn't really think about what they were doing at all. A fundamental lack of both client and advisor knowledge and expertise. So people tended to do what they knew rather than try something new. A fear of the unknown, but absolutely fundamentally, a lack of common standards in terms of how value and outcomes could be defined. And without that lack of common standards, we got pushback all the time from all parties within the construction supply chain as to whether or not you could ever actually change procurement, because actually, what are we procuring against? And that sort of indirectly then led to the work that I know Ron is going to talk about a little bit more, which is, you know, how can we define value? How can we make sure that those standards are in place? And if we have that definition of standards, can we then actually change the construction industry? So starting from a sort of fairly negative place of, well, everybody's unhappy, we did actually feel that change was possible. And, you know, that will lead to a change in business models. I think I've probably said enough, Andy, so I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much for that, Anne, and thanks for highlighting this, you know, whole question of what is a business model as well, because I think that's quite important. And I think for the purposes of this discussion, and I'm sure it'll be the case, that, you know, if at all possible, it would be good to try and widen that conversation around what we actually mean by the way the whole of the industry, how it does business, how it presents itself, how it shows the value of what it does, not just to clients, but also obviously, you know, to society as well, because I think that's important in terms of how we frame stuff going forward to the future. So with that in mind, it's probably good and apposite that we've actually got Ron Lang to speak next. Ron is another person who's very knowledgeable around this whole issue. Ron is Impact Director for Value at the Construction Innovation Hub, and value, I think, is something that will be very important and closely aligned with you know, with business models. Ron, in his role at the Construction Innovation Hub, which is doing some fantastic work, by the way, around this whole area of I suppose, dare I say it, future gazing. What sort of industry do we want to be in the future? The role of digital, the role of IT. So if you've not looked at their website, get on down to the Construction Innovation Hub and have a look. But Ron takes on responsibility at the Hub for driving whole life performance, outcome-based procurement, that word again, procurement. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that later. Outcome-based procurement models and data-driven decision making. So I'm sure Ron will have some very interesting takes on this whole area of business models. So Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy. Can you hear me okay?
Indeed.
Excellent. So thanks, Anne, for that context. Actually, it's really useful going into what I'm going to try and say. So good morning, everybody. Thank you to Infrastructure Intelligence for inviting me to join this discussion. I think, and I hope, Anne, that I'm going to cover both the system level and hopefully how that leads into some of those individual models that you spoke about. So let's see how it goes and see if I've stayed true to your taxonomy, if you like. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Construction Innovation Hub, as Andy said, we're a government-funded innovation program. We're part of the Transforming Construction Challenge, and we're tasked with catalysing change across the sector. So as Andy said, our work spans a number of themes. So we have value, which I'm going to talk about today. We have manufacturing, we have digital, and we have assurance. And we work closely with government and industry to develop concepts that can be adopted at scale. I think for me, though, it's about how do we create a path to a more productive and a more sustainable industry. So, you know, Anne's just touched on that really, but it pains me, and I've always been in construction. I'm diehard, I suppose, in that respect. But you know, it's such a great thing to be involved with, and actually, the way I look at it now, it doesn't feel like it's a very sustainable position that we find ourselves in, which is a real shame. So my job as part of the impact team is to ensure we focus on the right things, that we work with the right people, and that we're testing and embedding things at scale for maximum impact. So it's great that we've been given some cash really as an industry to look at these things, but we need to demonstrate to government that we can do something with it and that we can actually make a change as a result of it. So that's why I want to take the opportunity today to tell you a little bit more about the value framework, as we call it. And we wanted to talk about how this is both highlighting the need for and paving the way for those alternative business models that Anne speaks of. So I don't think I'm alone, and all the people that have joined this call, I guess, will be on the side of this, you would hope. But as we start to emerge from this unprecedented crisis, I really do believe there's never been a better opportunity to turn our backs on the current industry model. Now, it sounds quite harsh, but by that I mean a model that's grounded in lowest cost wins, input-output focused decision making. We must take seriously the uniquely powerful and privileged position we have as a sector, and that's to deliver better social, environmental, economic outcomes. And importantly, that's about outcomes from both what we deliver, the assets that we deliver and that we're all involved with, but also how we deliver them. And I think those two aspects often get confused. And a brief nod to kind of the state we find ourselves in terms of skills and training and people. I often hear people talking about how unattractive this industry is to new entrants, but I believe that's because we do, frankly, an appalling job of highlighting this privileged position that I speak about. I'm really passionate about that. And I think, in what other industry do so many people have such a direct role in creating the very fabric of society? And in what other industry do you have the potential to leave such a massive legacy that spans generations? I think that's a really exciting thing and something we don't make clear enough perhaps to new entrants. But I should probably pause on the word intentional, the word potential, and I use that intentionally there in that phrase, because if we start to realize that potential to have that kind of impact, we must start putting value and outcomes at the heart of decision making. And that means from the earliest stages of strategic planning through to things like who we work with, what we choose to deliver, how we choose to deliver it, and make those same valued decisions at every intervention through an asset's life. So one of the most exciting things about this vision and this movement, as I keep calling it really, is the opportunity it affords our supply chain to create new and innovative value propositions. So those value propositions are grounded in adding value rather than removing cost, passing on risk, and frankly, drawing the same hand we played on the last project. So this means product, services, and solutions that are focused on delivering maximum value for the client and which have a strong focus on genuinely differentiating from our competition. I suppose a side note, but as a former architectural engineer in my past life in this industry, I found that lack of space to consider alternative options and to deliver better solutions for my client really suffocating. So from my perspective, if we have more freedom to add value, it also goes some way to attracting and retaining talent in our workforce. So how is our value framework specifically helping to move this forwards? Well, I wanted to outline really the three kind of core technical work streams that are contributing to this work. So the first rather aptly sees us working with Anne and with the Construction Leadership Council to develop that industry-wide definition of value. So this directly addresses calls made in the sector deal for an industry-wide definition of value that goes beyond cost. And it also builds on the existing procure for value principles set out already in public spending principles. So we're not inventing anything new here. We're trying to create the tools and the processes to actually enable clients to do it. So the aim is to help clients to make informed choices on what aspects of value are relative importance, to their specific project or program, taking account of asset class and location specific requirements, but crucially working within policy-led boundaries. So in essence, we have to allow choice in how value is judged, but we must equally ensure clients are making those choices in an informed manner. So to butcher a perfectly good analogy, singing from the same balanced scorecard, I'm going to try that one. Let's see how it goes. So in recognition of its growing popularity in the sector and building also on the recent report by the ACE, we've adopted the 5 capitals model. We feel this is a good basis for value definition, and we've also now set out 20 categories of value across that model. These categories are shaped directly by policy and serve as a basis for making more balanced, more informed choices. Again, it's not about telling someone what value is, it's about allowing them to make that choice in an informed manner. So in the next phase of that work, and we've been working on this for around 9 to 12 months now, I think, Anne, although time is flying by, isn't it? But we'll be working directly with clients and with industry to agree what the measurement methodology for that looks like. So sitting behind each of those value categories, what are the metrics and the measures and the benchmarks as they apply to different asset classes and different client types? But just be reassured that we're not reinventing the wheel. We spent the last 12 months looking at in detail and piecing together every methodology, every tool, every initiative that we possibly could to try and bring the right people together and the right organizations. Because really, in order to succeed, we need to develop a consensus approach to this and one that's backed by public and private clients. So as an output to this work, we're also developing a web-based tool. So the idea is that this would guide clients through a conversation to make sure they can define their value expectations clearly. They can identify baseline performance against those and to compare different scheme options against those value expectations. And this will start us on the journey towards those procurement decisions that Anne referenced. Of course, in the future, we expect the scope of that tool to expand, but I think it's a good starting point for trying to make better decisions in procurement for sure. For the second work stream, I'm really delighted to say that we've been working with the ACE to develop a new client approach framework. So taking that client value definition, as I've just mentioned, as an input, this helps them to select a delivery model and a commercial strategy which embeds and maximizes their ability to deliver, of course, those value expectations. It will help clients to consider contextual factors such as their own capabilities, their potential risks or impediments to realization of that value, as well as the current market context. And that's quite interesting, the market context part, because as we have a market there to deliver, there's no point asking for better value. So more aspects of this value framework will be communicated in the coming weeks, certainly around that client approach framework. But it's safe to say we've been able to call on the services of some leading minds in this space through that collaboration. And I hope to see some initial outputs towards the end of this year, which is great. So finally, really, and coming to the point of this discussion, through the outputs of the first two work packages I've just described there, we now theoretically have a client who's able to articulate their value expectations in a clear and consistent manner. And we also have a client who has planned a delivery model and a commercial strategy that's grounded in achieving that value. So within that work, we'll be identifying some of those alternative, if you like, value and outcome-based business models. And to use Anne's terminology, we're talking about those supply chain business models really here, that are best suited to delivering on those new value-based client demands. So working closely with the supply chain, the third and final work package I'll describe here is around how we identify the opportunities for and address the barriers to wider uptake of these business models, as well as exploring the market response elements. So for example, I know Margot is going to go into some more detail, but do we have the right contracts? Do we have the right insurance products? Do we actually have the right IP models to support more collaborative, more outcome-focused ways of working? We'll also be exploring and mapping the client's value profile to their choice of technical approach. So which technical solutions are applicable for which value profiles? For example, and quite apt for the Construction Innovation Hub, when should clients look to a manufactured solution rather than a traditional solution? And how might value definition impact on material choices? There's a whole lot in here, but all these elements have the potential to disrupt the existing supply chain and provide significant opportunity for positive change, I believe. So if we can try and provide some clear sight of these dependencies and these linkages, we can probably, or I would hope, we can ensure that the market is ready to respond when clients start to ask for things in a more value-based way. So I think in summary, really, and to make sure we've got plenty of time for discussions to follow, I just wanted to raise my hand, really, to say that through the value framework, we are working closely with government and clients and industry to seize that opportunity to build a more sustainable, more outcome-focused model for our industry. And I'd really like you to be part of that journey. So if you feel you can contribute to this work or you'd like to know more, please do reach out and we can take some more detail there. But in the meantime, thanks for your time and I look forward to some questions.
Thanks very much for that, Ron. And it was interesting, the concentration there on value, which I think is something that, we really want to try and explore a bit more in the discussion, but also as well, very correctly highlighting, I suppose, the business frameworks that we have in the industry at the present time, particularly on the contractual side, because obviously you can have all the fine words about changing business models, but if in the way in which the industry contracts and actually does its business isn't set up to facilitate that, then we're obviously going to be extremely challenged in that area from day one. Hopefully we won't be, but nevertheless, I think we do need to recognise some of that, I suppose, commercial framework that we actually do have to operate in at the present time. And I think it's really good that we've actually got our next speaker, who is Margot Day, who is BuroHappold's Global Director of Risk and Commercial Law. And I'm sure she won't mind me saying this, is someone who, as a solicitor, a qualified solicitor and obviously a legal expert, is very well aware of the commercial side of things, but also in the short time that I've become aware of Margot's work, she's also someone who I think can explain things in, dare I say this, a very accessible way. I wasn't going to say a non-solicitorial way, because actually solicitors should be well understood anyway, but I think Margot is someone who really gets it, in my opinion, and actually is a real sort of asset to our industry in making that link between the legal and commercial side and I suppose the engineering side. So having sort of given her that massive build up, I better hand over quickly to Margot to let her say her bit in this webinar. Over to you, Margot.
Thank you, Andy. So I'll not start by saying any Latin or, whys and therefores and really long sentences, because I don't want to live up to the lawyerly way. Thank you. As Andy said, I am the Global Director for Risk and Commercial Law at BuroHappold, and I'm also the current chair of the ACE's Legal and Commercial Group. And I sit on the ACE board. I mean, with that, that's great because it means that I've been able to engage in the future of consultancy, which was something launched by the ACE. I want to say early in 2019, but I think it was actually end of 2018 that it was launched. So as I've taken up the role as the chair of the Legal and Commercial Group, we've been focusing on business models and looking at it from a legal and commercial aspect. Prior to being at BuroHappold, I had the pleasure of working with Sarah at Arcadis, and I worked there for 10 years, being the lawyer, the general counsel, and was involved in, digital transformation, as well as thinking about, how our industry starts to engage with digital transformation, something that I've been able to explore further at BuroHappold, and also just the way that it's implemented across the world, because I think there's a lot that we can learn from the way that things are being undertaken around the world. So when I think of business models, the commercial models that sit behind them to support them, and also about this whole question of value, I think about COVID-19, this crisis, and I think out of every crisis there comes opportunities and risk, but I think it's brought a real great opportunity to consider wider things in terms of what society regards as valuable. So, from net zero and our engagement with low carbon factors, biodiversity, sustainability, and, the real push for a green recovery has probably been something that's a lot easier to sell now than it would have been, say, 6 months ago. And so when we talk about value-based business models, I think the term value is a funny one, and it's something that Ron touched upon, because I've always considered that in construction and engineering projects, and particularly under OG procurement rules, value was always regarded as an acronym for cheap. What's the cheapest tender that's going to be submitted that will win the job? And whilst, it would talk about wanting people to come up with innovative solutions, at the end of the day, it always came back to cost. And so that's where you kind of go, we have what we say is a value that we want to get out of something, but value isn't being thought about in the wider context. And I think I am at least hopeful that there will be an opportunity to use COVID-19 to press the reset button, kind of a restart on the way that we engage with value, because I think there's a consumer demand that is different now. And that demand kind of ties back into, globally, people are really worried about what brands stand for and what they get from, aligning themselves with a particular brand. So you then start to apply that into the construction and engineering sector, and it's more about making sure that you can support clients and that they've got people that are part of their ecosystem and part of their supply chain. They're also exhibiting the same values of them. So I don't just mean values in terms of, statements that we all say as companies are values to us, but also in terms of how you're designing and thinking about the long-term sustainability of projects and, their impact upon the environment. And so I think it's a great time for us to really access this issue of what do we mean by garnering the force of new business models and implementing them into projects. And then I think of value also when we think about it from a legal context, because this country typically has quite a lot of construction disputes. The Technology and Construction Court was initially set up because of the number of disputes that there are. And so when we talk about value, we've got to get away from this whole predominance that we fall out over the whole construction process. It should be that value allows us to collaborate in a much more effective way. And I always think of it, at the beginning of every project, we've got so many collaboration ideals that are around with the parties, mutual trust and cooperation, something that's set out in the NEC agreements, but the extent to which you actually see it implemented on projects is not necessarily there. And so if we are going to start to move the business models, we need to move everything with it. And so that means taking clients, their procurement teams, and dare I say it, lawyers as well, on the journey that we have to move away from a blame culture towards a collaborative culture that allows us to implement the value that we actually want to create out of these projects. So if I think about it, you know, as Anne said, there is no one business model for our clients. There are numerous business models. But when I think about how the ACE is kind of looking at the value change and how consultants and engineers move their approach and the way that they work with clients and address business models, the thing that we need to be there is that we've got insurance to back us up. PII market and what's happened in the PI market over the last few years has meant that it's not necessarily sorry, I'll probably just jump back a sec. When I say what's happened in the PII market, it's mainly that there has been a contraction on the amount of PI insurers that are available, and cost of PI is going up. You may say, what's the impact of that? Well, it's just that it's driving up the cost for, you know, most consultancies and also construction practices. So the extent to which value can be created when you've got such large overheads having to be applied to just having PI to support you kind of takes away from what's the value that you're trying to get to at the end of the kind of output factor. So if we were to move away from so much of a blame culture where people are sharing in pain gains, and I mean that actually sharing in the pain gain, not just using the stick to beat you with when something goes wrong, then that may help to move the dial to move towards a lot more collaborative business models that actually help with the outputs that we want to create. If we think about the alliancing model, and I know alliancing is something that's in the ACE report on the future of consultancy, it has been utilised in a few projects in the UK, but not the extent that I would have anticipated. Alliance has been in place in the Asia Pacific and particularly in Australia for years, and has been used really successfully on major infrastructure projects. Now, the whole basis of alliancing is you move away from a blame culture. You move towards having that the parties are working together for a long-term solution to try and achieve the best value. So the value model becomes even more important because you take away the blame and you're actually getting people to buy into this whole culture of we'll put in to try and make sure that we sort out the issue as it arises. But again, this comes back to that would also assist our PI insurers, because if there was this blame culture that was taken away, you could actually start to work in a much more collaborative fashion. It would encourage innovation, and you know, you'd actually be sharing in IP and IPR. It's a factor that Ron highlighted in terms of, you know, who owns the IP and how do we move the dial so that it's not everyone trying to just keep their IP to themselves. I think in terms of procurement departments as well, there needs to be a change in terms of their understanding of what is meant by value and what they want to achieve as the actual output. But there's much work to be done in terms of taking lawyers, procurement departments on the same journey with us. We have to make sure that it's not just something that's looked as at an initial stage and then you lose it throughout the life of a project. So it does mean changing the way that you contract. It does mean actually trying to make sure that people buy in terms of the commercial models and the commercial deals that sit behind the business model. But it does come back to, if we are going to have values as a society, and I say values because, you know, a climate emergency, even things like Black Lives Matter and the way that we engage in the social issues that we have at the moment, it's all driving towards we have to change what we regard as our assessment for value. I'm going to stop there so that Sarah has a chance to speak, but I'll be interested in joining in any question and discussions later.
Thanks very much, Margot. I'm really interested to hear you talk there about you know, world events out with I suppose our sector, because I think it is important to understand, you know, where society is going and how that interacts on our industry, because we don't exist in a vacuum. You know, we do not, and I think it's really important that we actually do that. And it was also interesting to hear Ron as well talk about the need to attract new people into the industry, and how do we do that? It's all about how the industry looks to the outside world, and I think that's you know, really important as well. Margot spoke a lot there about you know, some of the commercial frameworks and procurement and the legal aspects, and someone who I know is working at the sharp end of dealing with you know, clients and dealing with the way in which the industry does its business is Sarah Wilkes, our next speaker, who's the Global Solutions Lead Business Advisory at Arcadis, who are one of the leading consultancy, multidisciplinary consultancy firms. I was going to say in the UK, on the planet, in fact. And I'm sure you know, Sarah will have some very interesting insight on this particular issue, because I know that she's been involved in the industry's work around business models through her work with the Association for Consultancy and Engineering in particular. But I won't steal any of Sarah's thunder. Go round. So Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. I'm delighted to be with you all today. It's great to be in this kind of forum, and also great to go last because I get to reference my fellow speakers in some of the things that they've said. And I'm going to start with that actually, because I just want to reinforce Anne's point around the myths around what a business model is. I think in my own journey, in my own education around the business models in the context of consultancy and our industry, is that they're often, that language is often used quite interchangeably with pricing models, and actually, you know, that they're very different things. There are not that many successful business models out there anywhere. I think there's maybe 9 or 10 that really work and that are tried and tested. But there's thousands of different pricing models that you can apply into our environment or other environments. So it's a really interesting conversation when you really start to talk to people about what is actually a business model. But I also want to start with saying that, you know, we need to think about the context that was all the things that were happening pre-COVID. So COVID now creates a different environment, but let's not forget what was already happening. And I thought it was important to recap on some of those things. So we were in an environment, both in consultancy, contracting, and our client environment across construction, around the rise of Industry 4.0, the rise of digitisation. We're hearing statements like data is the new gold, and you know, everyone's getting very excited by it, but also quite challenging in terms of, well, what does that really mean? What does that mean for value to our clients? What does that mean in terms of the way that we deliver our solutions from a consultancy perspective? And also there was some macro things going on around some global tensions around climate change in particular, and what's that doing to the decision making, particularly of our government-based clients, and the, you know, the impact that construction has on the environment. One of the biggest industries that's having a negative effect on our environment. So a lot of pressure coming towards us around what interventions we're making. And then there were some very specific things, that trends that were really sort of around clients wanting things faster, downward pressure on hourly rates. It was referenced earlier about the race to the bottom. Actually an increasing complexity around what our clients are asking for us, the problems they're asking us to solve, and the rise of technology innovations and how all that fits into lots of moving parts. There's the rise of the internal consultant. So our clients saying, actually, I think I can do it better myself. And you know, that was having an impact on how clients buy as well. And then there's been some new entrants into our markets, and I'll probably spell out 2 in particular around Catera in North America and Sidewalk Labs and what they were trying to do in Toronto. And the reason I reference them is I don't want to reference them as the, you know, the buzz references, but they're struggling. You know, they have underestimated the complexity of our industry. And Catera are now thinking about, well, what are we? And you know, they might have got a load of investment, but are they getting what they need from it, and how fast are they learning and understanding our industry? And similarly with Sidewalk Labs, you know, they've stepped away from Toronto because they grossly underestimated the complexity of public sentiment and the stakeholder engagement side of the work that we all do, and we all, you know, we all have to put a lot of effort into. So all this has been going on, and from my perspective, the work that I've been doing at Arcadis and now with ACE, which I'm very passionate about, is before we talk about new business models, there's a whole raft of innovation we can do in our existing business model as consultants. So we can innovate around the way we deliver our solutions without dramatically changing the value that's delivered to our clients. But it is changing the way we need to talk about value to our clients. So, for example, if we're on traditional time and materials contracts and we find an innovative way to automate part of our process, we're not actually incentivised to do that as consultants, because we're paid power by the hour, bums on seats, however you want to call it. Yet we're innovating constantly inside our organisations, and the only person that will benefit from that is the client. So we can't reinvest any of our money into R&D, and that's a real challenge for us. But those innovations are happening, and we've sort of coined the phrase of, in our organisation, around these epicentres of innovation, and you know, we're moving from quite considerable people-based delivery to a blend of people and technology and other ecosystem partners in the way in which we deliver our outcomes. There's also some innovation in the way we co-create with our clients as well. So there's an epicentre around you know, clients asking us for different things, and I reference the complexity of what they're asking us for. Sustainability is a really good theme in that. I mean, sustainability is a broad church, but clients are now saying, well, we need to deliver this, but we also have these requirements, and we're trying to meet our sustainable development goals, or trying to meet local employment targets. We want to impact local economies. So there's lots of add-ons to the brief and the requirements, and that's, we're trying to work through with our clients with that as early as possible in the process. But I am going to come back to procurement, because in my experience, and I'm sure this will resonate with any consultants on the call, is we have great conversations with our clients. We're all very innovative right at the front of the conversation where the forming stage is happening. But what comes out in the brief doesn't look anything like the conversation. And very rarely is the client then getting what it needs. It's not that the brief very rarely reflects, you know, ultimately the key things that they want to be delivered. It often has a very long shopping list of other things that have to be tacked on because of people's perceptions or rules, and that's where Ron, you know, the work that Ron's doing is really valuable to say, right, are you prepared to add something in that will dilute the focus on what you're trying to achieve? And this is where we've got to work collectively as an industry with our clients, with our supply chain, and as consultants in those conversations. We've got to make sure that we don't lose that value from the original conversations. I think COVID presents a massive opportunity. I think we are all now convinced that we don't have to be in an office to deliver value. I think the challenge around presenteeism is going to challenge the bums on seats models, and that is really already happening. You know, we have clients in North America in particular who, you know, have to see people in offices. I'm sure there's clients here as well that do the same. And now they're, you know, how can we work with 300 people in a network across different locations without actually all trying to get together all the time? So I think the challenge around the value of presenteeism and how you can do things differently is now wide open, and I think people will think about the balance. And I'm not saying we won't go back to workplaces, but I think we could overestimate the impact on workplaces. But something will change. But people still need that human interaction, and that's where creativity and innovation really does thrive. So we've got to get some balance back in the system. I think if anybody's read the McKinsey paper that's come out this week, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, you know, there's some stark realities in there to Ron's point around, you know, we're all passionate about our industry, but boy, oh boy, are we not productive. You know, the world's biggest ecosystem, I think it quoted something like 13% of global GDP, and we've only had 1% productivity growth in 20 years. I mean, come on, we've got to do something about that as an industry. And also, from a consultant's perspective, we're also recognising we also need to give our clients more choice. So not just say, this is how we can do it for you, almost work with them on what the options are. And that might not mean that we deliver everything in that solution, that we work with a broader ecosystem, and that brings more value, more sharing of risk, more insight and innovation from what we've all delivered in the past from different perspectives. And that diversity, I think, is going to deliver some value as well. And there's also potentially a threat with, you know, unemployment. You know, I don't think we should underestimate the next 12 months to 2 years of what we're going to go through as an industry from an unemployment perspective, but also there is the rise of the gig economy. I'm working with quite a lot of independent consultants, and friends of mine have moved into that space on purpose because they want to have different careers, different opportunities. And there is definitely a trend from experts, subject matter experts, moving into that space. And dare I say, there'll be the trip advisor of consultancy in the future, where we all get rated as individuals on the value that we deliver. So that's probably not that far away. So we'll all have to pull our socks up and make sure we're delivering. And we also need to look out, we look outside in and look at other sectors of the market that have successfully digitised, that have successfully built ecosystems, and that have successfully reinvented themselves towards their client needs. You know, we can look at the consumer markets, and they've really embraced technology in particular, and that data-driven mindset, not just assuming you know what the customer wants, finding the data points that give you the evidence to tell you what they want. And let's not underestimate that scalability can deliver value for clients. So again, if we're allowed a little more freedom, a little bit more ability to research, develop and innovate, actually we as consultants can create scalable solutions for our clients, which means they're not just getting something that's a one-off or something that's tailored for them. They're learning from the last 100 times that we've delivered it, not just the last time we've delivered it. And I think that's really valuable as well. And finally, I think, you know, we're in it together. We as consultants can't come up with innovative business models unless the customer can consume them and the supply chain is prepared to deliver them. And on that, I will shut up and wait for questions.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And those questions are coming in on a fairly rapid basis, actually. So I think we'll get to them in a second. But I think we've had a lot of different aspects of the subject talked about here, and I'm sure we'll return to many of them over the course of the next half an hour or so. But the first question I want to start off with is, I suppose, a sort of a big picture question, really. Edward Murphy asks, Steve Jobs once said, to develop a product that will sell in billions of units, you need to start with the customer and work back to the technology, not start with the technology and find a customer to accept it. So how do we get our industry to start with the customer and work back to the product? Ron Lang, your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm always a fan of a Steve Jobs quote as well. I suppose I could, yes, I think that's right. I don't think we do that. But what would worry me, or what would challenge, is that I suppose what we're trying to address is whether the client is actually clearly articulating what they want in the first place. So you could argue that it's the industry and the supply chain's job to try and tease that out of them. But actually, you know, we've all, in all of the pitches we've just done, we've said how complex this system is. And I keep talking about the supermarket analogy of when you go and try and choose your fruit these days. You want fair trade, but some of the fair trade ones are in plastic, and that means it's a decision about environmental contamination. It becomes such a difficult choice to make that I think we need to help clients. So really, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help clients to make balanced and informed decisions such that that can then be passed on to the supply chain to respond to. So it's a great question. I just think it's a two-way thing. I don't think we can expect the supply chain to extract those thoughts.
And your thoughts on that? Obviously, we're not selling computers here, and we're not, you know, the industry is a bit more complex than just selling, if you like, a product in and of itself. But nevertheless, we're in a marketplace and there's competition in that marketplace. How do we get that proper focus on what the customer wants? You're muted.
First,
you can just
right, sorry about that. So it's very interesting because, you know, what were Apple actually selling? Were Apple selling phones, or were Apple selling communication systems, or were Apple selling music storage systems? Or, you know, actually, even although that's it's quite a simplistic answer to a very, very complex thing, even for Apple, let alone for the construction industry. I think, though, what they probably were selling was, you know, if you like, user experiences. Ultimately, that's probably what Apple sell, and I don't know their business model. And I think that that's where we go wrong. We don't actually concentrate. It's not even the client, in my view. It's actually the end user experience. So you know, if you're building a railway bridge, it's fairly straightforward, I guess, that the user wants to make sure the train will go from A to B in a safe and speedy manner. But if you're building a school or a hospital, what's the user experience we're actually trying to promote? You know, are we trying to improve the education of children, or are we trying to keep the rain off them? Because they're two very, very different things that we might be actually trying to achieve. And so I completely agree with Ron that the role of certainly of advisors, but also actually of contractors and supply chain as well, it's not just the advisor's role, is to really help clients understand what the different outcomes could be and how far their money will go. Because, you know, many conversations, certainly that my business would get involved in, always get back to money in the end. But actually, money, again, is a movable feast, because it's not just about capital costs, it's about maintenance costs, running costs, occupation costs, etc. So even when the conversation is, I've only got X, it's, well, what does X mean anyway? And at the moment, I think there is a huge gap between the options that clients are offered and the things that are possible, because we go far too quickly to a solution rather than actually considering all the different ways that we could achieve those ultimate outcomes that the client is trying to deliver. And I do think that's incumbent on our industry to say, just slow down a bit, and can we actually work through this for another couple of days before we decide it's one of those? So I don't think it's as simple as Apple, and I'm sure Apple's not simple, but I think it's achievable.
Margot, are we focused enough on the customer in your experience? I mean, you probably come across some of the end users possibly under not exactly ideal circumstances given your line of work, but, you know, do we have a sufficient focus on the customer and then work back from there in your experience?
I think that most jobs start off with a customer experience. I don't know whether they start off with a user experience though. So I think it's the difference between, you know, we do things the way that we've always do it. And I like the Einstein quote, which, you know, if you keep on doing the same things and expecting a different result, that's the definition of insanity. But that is what we have tended to do as an industry. You know, we start off with the customer discussions, we start off with the innovative approach, and then we go, okay, but let's now just shoehorn it into the way that we've always done it. And so we move away from the user experience and perhaps, you know, utilizing the skills of, you know, consultants and joining in contractors with that, because it's not just about how you work from it from, say, a design perspective. It's how you can actually implement it on the job, and so you do have to have lots of different participants involved. But I do think, I don't know, I think the great thing working at BuroHappold and kind of seeing that clients perhaps approach us for our innovative solutions. So when I think about the way that we use grid shell structures, you know, that was really innovative at the time and also very beautiful, but that came back to clients wanting it for the user experience, and therefore that's how the demand was met, that we could utilize that on projects. If we focus more upon the user experience rather than saying, that's fantastic, now we're going to take that and put that into our procurement model. And I use the sausage machine analogy, but we just come back to using the sausage machine every time. So, okay, we'll just take this contract off the shelf and we'll shoehorn whatever you're trying to do into that, as opposed to, oh, you want to do this slightly differently. Let's take your whole experience, your user experience and your client values of what you want, and then we'll completely rewrite the contract and the procurement model in order that the commercials that sit behind it align with what you want, if that makes sense.
That makes absolute sense. Thanks very much for that. Sarah, you must have some perspective on this in terms of some of your work, both in terms of your day job and also your work on behalf of the industry. Your thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm gonna. Einstein's getting a lot of airplay, but I think he's quite a lot. You know, Einstein said if he had an hour, he'd spend 55 minutes on the problem and understanding the problem, and 5 minutes on the solution. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. We're consultants for a reason. We're experts in our field, and we should have confidence that we can solve those problems. But what we often underestimate is understanding the problem to be solved. And that might sound really simple, But we have to test our assumptions, and we have to get better at testing our assumptions, and data is going to help that. Data is going to accelerate our ability to take sentiment, opinion and emotion out of our decision making and go to hard facts. So I think, yeah, I mean, we use a lot of design thinking techniques where you map personas, you map pains, gains, jobs to be done, and trying to work out, is this a unique problem to be solved, or is it a mass problem to be solved? You know, does every asset manager have the same problem, regardless of if they're in rail, highways or water or corporate real estate? Chances are a lot of the problems will be very similar. So how do you make your solutions fit the majority and then tailor them for the minority? And I think that's where you get more of a user experience, because you're not starting from scratch every time, which means we're being more productive, to the point about our industry. But often we start things from we're reinventing the wheel constantly. But you also do need to focus some elements of it on the asset type or the environment that you're placing that solution into. But as consultants, we've got thousands of solutions and we're constantly trying to fit them to problems, and that's a real challenge for us. We've got to reprogram our brains.
Thanks for that. Got an interesting question here, which I think will probably spark a little bit of debate. In fact, I've got a couple of those actually. But firstly, I've got a question here from Gary Sanderson from Visualize Limited. He said, it's great to hear the concepts around better connecting business models to social value creation. But what do the panel see as the most significant behavioural barriers to getting us where we need to go? And I think I'll ask that question first to Anne Bentley, if she has a view on that.
So I think behaviour, I mean, there's a lot of theory around behaviour, and you know, is it carrot or stick? Do people change their behaviours because they're forced to or because they want to? And you know, do they even understand what their behaviours are in the first place, and the impact of their behaviours on other people? And I think that we sort of need to address behaviours again in the round of the industry. It's no good picking on one part of the industry and go, well, if you behave better, the whole industry will be better, because actually it is a complete system, and you sort of have to change all of it. But if there were one single behaviour that I think we really need to look at very, very closely indeed, it's the understanding and allocation of risk. I think that the misbelief, and I really do believe it is a misbelief, that risk can be transferred to the lowest common denominator on a project, and that then nobody will ever have any risk again as long as we write it in the right contractual form, and we have a big enough disincentive to people to sort of not do anything wrong, if you like. World will be good. It's just bizarre. I mean, there's no other part of sort of economic life, I would suggest, where we assume that just because you've written it down, it's true. And yet we all know it's not true as well. So for me, that the fundamental, this goes right, it's not even the client, it goes pre-client, it's funder actually, end user, funder, everybody really has to understand where the risk lies, who's best to cope with the risk, what the cost of coping with the risk is. But then the counter side of that is who is also incentivized to either take risk or to get rid of risk as well. And at the moment, both risk and incentivization are poorly understood, and where they are understood at all, they're often ignored. So it's about risk and incentivization are my two biggies. And you know, if somebody does something good, better, cheaper, faster, whatever, they should be incentivized, not disincentivized. And yet a lot of our practices disincentivize people to do that.
Thanks, Anne, for that. Ron, you spoke quite a lot about social value when you addressed us earlier. What, in your view, what's the most significant behavioural barrier to getting us where we need to go, maybe in relation to that? Any view?
Yeah, so I think I would build on what Anne said. So for me, it's about, I would pick on kind of ownership and evidence. So where are those outcomes owned? You know, who is responsible for those outcomes is not always clear. And I mentioned about, I'm going to bring evidence in. the linkages between what you do as an individual on a project or as a business in a project or whatever, and the links to the actual social value achieved are not always clear, and we don't have good evidence base for it, to Anne's point. So I think, and also there's a short-termism to it. So just measuring the social outcomes, again, of the project in the short term to tick a box that you've done it, I don't think is enough. I think if we get people to take social value seriously, we need to take a longer-term view of it. And I think one of the concepts we're trying to look at as a hub is how you create a kind of index through the life of the asset to make sure that asset continues to add value through life, and where you need an intervention at a point in time to increase that. So yeah, I would go with, does everybody really understand the part they play and the role they play in delivering social value? And do we have the evidence to find those linkages between those behaviours and the social value that's realised?
Okay, thanks for that. Margot, your thoughts?
I liked what Anne said, just in terms of, where does risk best lie? Who's best to manage risk? I would love to see that risk is not just pushed down the chain, because that's what drives the certain behaviours that we have in our industry. I'd love to see a world where everyone just got along, and I can say that in a very dreamy fashion. But I'd also like to see that we try to, instead of seeing risk as just passing it down the chain or around a room as in a kind of pass the parcel way, that it's something that we all share in, so that there's this value created that we're all going to share in, because it will drive towards, the better delivery of a project. And, Sarah touched upon data. Data is great because it allows us to have informed decisions as we go through, any process. But how do we actually encourage the right behaviours? The contracts don't necessarily do that. They start from a notion of saying that they will want to encourage the right behaviours, but then you start to put KPIs into projects. Then you start to say, you've got to have this certain insurance in order to work with us. You start to then say, oh, we also want to take all of the IP that's created on this project. So you're not necessarily then having this whole behaviour point kind of solidified in what you put in the background in your contract. It would be much better if people could approach it from understanding, we're going to develop this with you, but the IPR and how we share it and what we use it for is going to help both of us. You in terms of how you look after your asset, let's say, and us in terms of further solutions that we're able to provide to clients and across the industry in order to have an impact. It would be much better that we take away this blame culture and the need to have this insurance program to back us up, but actually that we'll have a no blame culture, and we'll all tie in, because we're in this for the long term to work together. But we need to have structures that support the behaviours, and we do need to try to incentivize good behaviours, as opposed to always having the KPI that just means that you're going to get less money if you don't do something.
Interesting there about barriers and blame culture. Sarah, I mean, isn't it the case that the whole construction procurement model is just too adversarial, and as a consequence, it's just not able to embrace change? Discuss.
Yeah, I mean, picking up on all the points, actually, I mean, it goes back to Anne's point around where does the risk sit, linked to Ron's point about ownership. I mean, the gain share models can be a car crash in this regard, because in effect, you an incentivized environment, but it's so dependent on the client's behaviours that all the risk is pushed onto the contractor or the consultant. And what we've got to do is, for me, it's a mindset shift from KPIs to collective benefits delivered. Otherwise, we're going from ticking boxes, which is we are now on most things, and there are some added value benefits, social value delivered, but usually it's forced, it's difficult, it's at the cost of something on the project. So I think that mindset shift is really important, but really understanding how everybody has a role to play in that. There's a discipline, and Ron's heard me talk about this in our ACE meetings, is baselining. Do we all agree this is the starting point, and this is what's been measured in terms of the environment and the interventions we're going to make on a project or a programme, or this is what we expect to happen, and this is who we expect to own that and to deliver that. But collectively, if we all do that and all work together and support each other on that, then there might be some enhanced social value benefits, and it's that stronger together mindset as well. So I think there's a lot to do there. Everybody's talking about social value, and you could say the same for sustainability as well, and the climate response. It's a very similar conversation, but we've got to get over this tick box mindset that's driven through the contracting mechanisms. One for Margot to solve.
Let's just explore that one a little bit more. Tim McHugh's posted an interesting question, and it lights on the issue of clients. I think we have to be careful how we don't have an industry. And Tim says that they select procurement routes and effectively dictate business models on a system level. And it's the choices that they make, notably but not exclusively, selecting largely on the basis of the cheapest. And he says that they may be responsible, and he calls it a parlor state of our industry. He said he'd be very interested to hear what the panel members think, that we need to expect massively more from clients, and we need them to be more intelligent, in inverted commas. I don't just like saying that we want more intelligent clients. That sounds like you're insulting them. And if so, if that's the case, if we do need more informed clients, what's being done to improve their approach so that they, if you like, with us, get it? You know, how do we actually make that happen? Or does there need to be a much more collaborative approach from day one? And I'll pose that question initially to Ron Lang, if Ron can give us his views on that.
Thanks, Andy. So I lost the middle bit of that, but I think.
Well, essentially, what needs to be done to Tim says improve clients. I think he means educate them, inform them, etc., etc. So we're all on the same page.
Yeah, and I think we've touched on it in places in terms of the role of clients and consultants working together to identify how these things. So to give you an example, when we look at the value framework we're developing and those categories of value that we're starting to put in front of clients, Anne and I have had many conversations about, yes, it doesn't replace the conversation that needs to go on every project and every program between a consultant team and a contracting team and the client about how those value categories actually apply to their particular circumstance. And that's really important because at a granular level, even where you are building something and in what local area and who it's for and all the rest of that makes a difference. So there is no, as I said in my sort of 10-minute slot, there is no one profile for value. So I think it will always be a conversation. That's really important. There is clearly a huge variance between, I'll do the same as you, the intelligence across different clients as well. So I suppose it's about how do we give them, again, some boundaries in how they look at things in a considered and consistent way. I like the transparency element. So one of the things I'm really keen on with the work we're doing is imagine how powerful it would be to see different clients, and I'm not necessarily talking just about public here, but if you did think about across the public portfolio, how different clients within the public sector viewed value. You know, if you imagine it as a spider diagram almost of those different departments, I think giving that kind of transparency to the supply chain to see what clients value would be really interesting. And you would then be inundated, no doubt, with consultants and parts of the supply chain wanting to show that client how they could maximize those areas of value. So again, I think it all starts with that kind of clarity around what they're expecting, but it then is a conversation about how you maximize that for a particular project or a program.
Margot, what's your thoughts on that? You spoke earlier, well, just a few minutes ago, about trying to forget the blame culture. How do we do that? Are we doing enough to? I will have to use the phrase educate clients where they need educating.
I think we can always do more, and I don't think education stops for any of us. And I think the main point with this is it's not necessarily the client's intelligence. The client, from private and public sector can be any number of people. But the problem, as I see it, can be, have you got the right people in the room that are informed and actually going to be a part of the decision-making process? So, you can start to iterate your ideas and come up with some great innovative solutions with a client, contractor team, everyone sat around the table. But have they actually joined the procurement department into that? And have they joined their lawyers into that? And are they saying to them, this is what we have all decided are the values that we want to get out of it? Because it's too often that you kind of do the iterations of the solutions that you're coming up with the client, but then the output of that is just a piece of paper that's sent off to a procurement department to then decide how, you know, how the project should come up, and you need to make sure you've got the right people in the room. I also kind of like the idea of giving clients a kind of scorecard, back to Ron's points, in terms of what's the values that they want at each different stage. So a scorecard of what they want and from whom. If you've got everyone in the room, then you're actually able to start to address it so that you can see if you're delivering upon it. Instead, we tend to say, this is what you want, and we're doing that whole, here's a solution. Let's not think through each stage of what we actually need to do. And I think there's some work to do, and I think certainly through the work we're trying to do on the future of consultancy is to try to create this scorecard, this vision of the different steps that you can take at each stage. And I think, you know, we're all trying to just build so that we can enhance clients' knowledge, but also the knowledge within our own organisations and across our industry, so that we're all going on this step change so that we can try to implement change.
I like this concept of getting the right people in the room, because, you know, obviously our industry has a certain reputation, particularly when you look at things like diversity in all its forms. But, you know, are we influencing clients in the right way by having the right people in the room, not just, you know, I suppose people in leading positions and so on, but also different sort of experiences bringing to the table. I mean, I don't know whether you, Anne, have got any thoughts about that in terms of how we try and change mindsets in the industry, because sometimes it does come down to mindsets and the way in which people have always worked.
I mean, it's interesting. So just, you know, I personally do have a bit of issue of sort of blaming clients for their own lack of knowledge, because, I mean, if I went to buy a car and somebody said, well, I'm not going to sell you the car because you don't understand the workings of the internal combustion engine, I'd be a bit put out. And so I think that we have to ask the question, how do clients get their knowledge? You know, it's not actually blaming a client for not, they might know everything about producing baked beans and nothing about building a baked bean factory. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's the first thing, that we do have to recognise that construction is remarkably complicated. I was speaking to the chief executive of a big contractor recently, and he said people think building is easy. It's not. It's really, really difficult to build a big complex building. And so I think that in terms of how do we get the right people around the table and how do we make sure we're having those conversations, I think much of that does fall to the role of the advisors. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, the first people most clients would appoint is some form of advisor. It's a really unusual client that would go straight to a builder or even to a designer, actually. Whether it's an accountant, a lawyer, or you know, some sort of business advisor, whatever, they will almost certainly talk to somebody and go, I'm thinking of doing this, whatever this is. And it's at that point where we can add the greatest value. It's at that point where behaviours can be changed, the right people can be brought into the room. And actually, it's incumbent upon all of us who work in that advisory space to be just as collaborative as we're asking everybody else to be, because it's really easy. I mean, and let's face it, we've all got, again, going back to an earlier thing about business models, we've all got our own business functions to address. And, you know, how easy is it for you, any consultant, any advisor, to be brought in and thought, well, I'm not actually 100% expert in this. I know 90% of it, but I'm not 100% expert. But do I really want another consultant brought in at this point, because they might steal a bit of my work or a bit of my thunder? And we've actually got to encourage that collaborative behaviour amongst advisors, amongst clients, amongst supply chain, amongst contractors. It's not just that we should be telling contractors to be collaborative. We've got to be equally collaborative ourselves, and we've got to encourage our clients to be equally collaborative. And I think the only way we can ultimately do that is by demonstrating the benefits. And there are actually now many projects out there, many procurements, many delivery models that are actually quite collaborative and have produced really good results. And so part of it is putting our money where our mouth is and going, well, actually, if you want a better project, this one over there that worked really well, so why don't we do it that way? So, you know, we've got to move forward together on this to change the behaviours and get the right people around the table. And that actually requires all of us to be quite adult.
Sarah, I know there's been a degree of soul searching in some of the ACE's work about how the industry works in and of itself. Your observations maybe based on a little bit of that. I'm not expecting you to bare your soul, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, I've got both an ACE sort of perspective, but also a personal perspective as well. I've an experience of a project environment from many years ago, and how we can all lead in that environment as well. So I think we just, I empathise a lot with our clients, and I've been talking to sort of Hannah at ACE about this a lot. They're going through their own transformations, particularly our public sector clients. And let's not underestimate the changing environment. And what you find in those environments is, well, people often move around roles. So they're never getting the depth of understanding. And that's often where the market for consultancy has come from, that demand has been created by the fact that there's a lot of generalists. And yes, they have experts in certain areas, but a lot of them are leading programs and they're not necessarily there. They're buying in that advice to plug gaps in capability, but also to learn from other things that we've delivered to other clients in similar scenarios. So I think we just need to be careful about what they're going through and the impact that has on how they behave towards the marketplace as well. I think the other thing to say is that we have got to change the framework culture in this. 5-year frameworks do nobody any favours, because particularly with the advancing technology and macro effects, economic cycles, COVID crisis and everything else, 5-year framework with hourly rates doesn't give you the ability to get what you need from that as well, and that really just stifles some of the environment. And the personal story is, we've also got to back ourselves. I mean, particularly from consultancies, if we're going to be the best advisors in our marketplaces, we've got to learn the lessons from what we've done before. I mean, I come from a background when I did proper work of urban development and regeneration. And I remember saying, why is it taking us so long to get outline planning? Why is it taking us so long to get that outcome? Let's have a look back as to why, and next one we do, let's try and do something different. And we happened to get a client that was really up for that. And we went through the usual tender process and we gave them the price in line with the scope. But we also said to them, in our experience, it's actually going to cost you this. But if you do that and you spend that money, you can get something that would take 5 years in 2 years. Do you want to do that? And we backed ourselves to do that. I think there is a responsibility on us to have those conversations with our clients if we know the answer and we know what needs to change in those environments as well. Margot might remember it because I'm sure she signed off on the approvals of that one.
Thanks for that. And just sort of starting to bring things to a close. A number of people there referred to, maybe we should talk about the stuff that does work, that has shown how things can be different. And I don't know whether the panel can maybe mention or reflect on any sort of areas where where they've seen where you thought, yeah, that actually is a really good example of what we're trying to do here, whether it be an example of true disruption in our sector, a client who really gets it, an area of work or a particular sector within the sector that is currently basically doing some really innovative and interesting stuff. And I'm going to ask each of you in turn whether you can actually whether there is any areas you can actually mention on that, and feel free to plug anything that you want. I'm going to kick off with Ron again on that. Is there anywhere that you could say, yeah, they're getting it, they're doing it really well?
Okay, so I'm going to try not to turn a positive into a negative immediately. So I think there are lots of good examples to give a diplomatic answer, Andy. And actually, the report that the ACE recently launched around the 5 capitals model, I can't remember the specific title, sorry, gave some really good examples in there about how people had taken, particularly around each of the capitals, different decisions and done things differently and delivered genuine value. But my cautionary bit to add to that was that what we found through the development of the 5 capitals model is often we get examples in one particular capital. Mm-hmm. So where a client is very, very, very passionate about one of those capitals, whether that's social value or environment or whatever it is. And it means that, again, that balanced approach isn't there. So that's my kind of, yes, there are lots of good examples, but is it a genuinely joined up solution? I don't know. I think some of the positive signs that I see coming from those kind of long-term asset operation and maintenance type things. So if you look at Legal & General and what they're doing around ownership, long-term ownership of stocks of houses, it gives them an opportunity, I think, to look at it much more in the round that we often don't have on construction projects. Even within the public sector, often assets like schools get passed on to a local authority or passed on to even to a head teacher, I guess, as the owner. So yeah, I think there are some good examples, but I just want to make sure that we're doing these things in a balanced way and an informed way.
And you've got a bit of a global view across the whole of the industry, Lee, and maybe it's a bit unfair to sort of just ask you to, pick out, one or two areas where you think, yeah, they're really getting it, right. But, sometimes life is unfair, and I'm going to ask you to do that.
Well, I think, I mean, again, there's lots of complexity into this, and it sort of depends what the it is. But I think some of the models that have been pushed out, particularly actually, to be fair, in the public and regulated sectors, so things like the insurance-backed alliancing model that, I think Margot sort of mentioned, and it's now probably, there's only been 3 or 4 projects that have actually used it in anger, but actually those projects have been very successful. And I think some of the pity is that these are seen as sort of pathfinder projects when they actually should be just seen as fairly standard sort of contractual arrangements. So there's certainly things like that. I think the work that has been done in the infrastructure sector on Project 13 and really, again, encouraging the sort of integrated delivery model rather than the sort of multifaceted delivery model, I think that is also moving us forward. I mean, I can go back actually to the best project I have ever been involved with in terms of this, which is actually goes back quite a long time, but it again takes in the sort of point that Ron was making, where it was an owner-occupier who was there for the long term, not the short term, and so was therefore actually able to make decisions not just about capital costs, but about what the asset was like when it was occupied, what its lifespan was supposed to be, how it sort of the users would interface with it. And that was actually a Ministry of Defence project, not a client that would necessarily be thought of a particularly forward-looking client, but because they were really, really concentrating on what they were going to use the asset for rather than just how much the asset cost. They got one of the most fabulous buildings I've ever worked on, and it wasn't expensive. I mean, it was phenomenal value, both short-term and long-term. So I think there are definitely some really good examples out there, but it is certainly easier in the owner-occupier market than it probably is in the developer market, I would say.
Margot, can you hear me?
I can.
Your views on that? Sorry, I think I might have frozen for a second there. Your views on that?
I think it's difficult to choose one project. I was going to respond to one thing that Anne said earlier, just in terms of the collaborative behaviours. And, I remember the Highways Agency, as it was then, came out with the Better Collaborative Framework. And the whole idea behind that was you didn't just choose an organisation, you chose the best person from an organisation to work with the other best people from an organisation. And when that whole thing, I remember the whole time that our team was spent with the client talking about it. And when the papers landed and the contract landed, it didn't reflect anything that had been spoken about in the initial phase, because it harked back to the exact same thing of you've got to have insurance, you've got to have this for each liability. And it's like, but you're not encouraging the very thing that you talked about. Because actually, I thought that was something that could really work. You take the best people from our industry, you smush them together, and then you've actually got that kind of hive mind that's working. So that was just one point I wanted to redress, because it does come back to reinforcing, how we can utilize our industry and change our behaviors. In terms of projects that have worked well, there's a few that I can think of in BuroHappold. There's the Red Sea project that's worked really well, trying to utilize digital twinning and using innovative solutions. Yes, it's a private client, lots of money to spend in terms of master planning and what they want to do with it, to anything like the dual Changi Airport, which is not only beautiful and sustainable and very green, it's got at its heart, some really great engineering design. But I guess the great thing in all of these examples is everyone trying to come up with an innovative solution together, and that being harnessed by the client relationship. And I think of other things that we've kind of done in the BuroHappold world that are simple, but that have had a a lasting effect. So like the High Line in New York, that's such a beautiful area that's, you know, about reutilizing the meatpacking district and the really industrialized space and turning it into something that's beautiful. If you look at the user experience now and the user experience when it was initially set up, it's still just getting better and better. It comes back to this: how do we embed the user experience and making sure that we utilize that whole knowledge across the project to get the best for it, rather than going back to our old behaviors, dare I say.
Thanks, Margot. And finally, Sarah, you're in a privileged position of being our last speaker on this issue. So, what are your thoughts on this? On this, you know, who's getting it right, apart from your organisation, of course?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's just one example that I'll give from my organisation, but I do want to give a shout out to a client to end it on. So I'll go that way in that order. Just going back to my point about incentivising automation and innovation. So I'm going to go for a Dutch example, obviously. Dutch company. We do a lot of work for ProRail in the Netherlands, and in parts of our process of what we offer them, we managed to take a 3-week manual process and automate it to push the button. Now, we would never have done that if we were on a time and materials contract. So that's not even about Arcadis, that's about you as clients understanding that you need to create the right commercial environment to help us to innovate. And ultimately, the client got a reduced price for that service, that element of the service. So it was win-win. We got to do our R&D, we got to innovate and use the technology available to us. But ultimately, the client did get the same outcome for a cheaper price. And it's not cheaper is the wrong word. They got better value from the money they were spending. And I think that's something that is, you know, every consultant can do that. The technology is there for us all to do that, but how you buy and how you procure us is fundamental. And then I'm going to close on a shout out to Birmingham City Council, because in the last 5 years they have transformed the impact on social value in that city through the way they procure. And I think we are stronger for it as consultancies that are in that city, because we work together now towards that. We have more forums about what we're all doing together. We work with the contractors and the supply chain and the other public bodies in that arena. And if you take and run, I'd urge you to take a closer look at that if you haven't already, but they've genuinely delivered a lot of social value in many, many guises across that city over the last 5 years. But that was a leadership of behaviour from the council that says, actually, we're going to put an element of value in our procurement on delivering stuff that has nothing to do with the project.
Thanks, Sarah, for that. I'm actually glad you finished with Birmingham City Council, because it's given me an opportunity to crowbar something in about the Olympics, actually, because obviously coming up in Birmingham, we've got the Commonwealth Games, haven't we? And it'd be very interesting to see whether that social value sort of approach is actually carried on. I hope it is. And I think in many ways, although if you look at, you know, just the cost of the Olympics, and I'm stealing a bit of Ron's thunder here because he sent us a message earlier on. If you look at the cost of the Olympics, you think, whoa, hang on a minute, that was unbelievably expensive. But if you actually look at the impact of it, although I still think there's an unfinished story there about things like, you know, health and all the rest of it, because I don't think we actually did enough to put the building blocks in place afterwards. However, you know, it was seen as so important that we had to do it, that actually the money almost wasn't an object. Now, this is not me arguing on behalf of the industry to clients just to say, look, it doesn't matter how much it costs, think of the impact. You know, there obviously has to be something around that. But I think sometimes we need to think about exactly the impact that this industry has on people's lives, because it is profound. And actually, when it's done right, it is absolutely fantastic. And I don't think we should ever forget that, because, you know, we are working in a brilliant industry. Anyway, we've run out of time. As always, I'd just like to thank all of our panel today, to Anne Bentley, to Sarah Wilkes, to Margot Day, and to Ron Lang for their inputs and for giving us generously of their time. It's clear a lot of issues have come up today, and some really, you know, good ones that we can, you know, continue the discussion on. You know, net zero, got to mention briefly, but I know there's a lot more that can be said about that and how that might impact on business models going forward. We do have a webinar in July on net zero, so make sure you sign up for that if you haven't already, on the 3rd of July. One of the things, and I'll finish on this, that I think really came across today is how we communicate as well is really important. You know, that interaction between clients, consultants, contractors, everybody in the industry, it's really important. And coincidentally, we have a webinar on communications next Friday, communications in a digital landscape. We're all doing this kind of thing now, the Zooming, the teaming, the GoToWebinaring, and we've got a really interesting conversation and discussion next week about how you make that better. How can we actually communicate better, and not just the strategy of it, but also some of the practicalities of using some of this, some of this technology. So do join us, same time, same place next week, 11 a.m. Thanks to everybody for taking part today. Thanks to our speakers and thanks to our attendees. And we hope to see you again soon. So from everyone here, it's bye-bye.
Thank you.